The LSAT continues to change, but what should you do about all of these changes? Well, today we are joined by special guest, Steve Schwartz, founder and CEO of LSAT Unplugged, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about it. For those of you who are new, my name is Sydney Montgomery. I'm the founder and executive director here at Barrier Breakers, where we specialize in working with first generation, minority, and immigrant college and law school applicants. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on, Sydney. Always a pleasure.
Do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your LSAT practice, and how students can get in contact with you and what things you offer?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Sydney. So I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005. Started off just tutoring privately one-on-one. Let me backtrack a little bit before that. I started on my own LSAT journey with low diagnostic scores in the low 150s, and they stayed there for quite some time. Over the course of what ended up being an entire year, I brought my score from a 152 to a 175 on test day, started teaching others what I learned. Eventually, I started a blog, a website, a YouTube channel, a podcast of the name LSAT Unplugged. Folks can find me across all social media channels at LSAT Unplugged, and I'll send you the links for that. And basically, my goal is to help students avoid making the same mistakes I did back on my own LSAT journey. It shouldn't have to take you a year to reach your goal LSAT score. I want to let you do it in less than half the time. And so we offer live online classes via Zoom, on-demand video courses, small group coaching, and one-on-one coaching. I have a great team of instructors helping me out. And so folks can feel free to reach out anytime via DM or email if they're interested in finding out more.
Awesome. I love that. And so I have so many questions about this LSAT and your take on the LSAT changes. I know that students are aware, hopefully, that starting in August, the logic games section is going away. Do you want to tell us a little bit of overview of some of the changes that we can expect and how it differs from the current LSAT exam?
Yes, of course. So right now, the LSAT has three different types of sections. You have logic games, logical reasoning, and reading comprehension. Logic games is the most notorious section of the exam. A lot of students are intimidated by it at first, but it is actually the most learnable section of the test. And the LSAT is changing later this year, as you mentioned. They are removing the logic games section and replacing it with a second scored logical reasoning section. The impetus for this change being that a few years back, a blind test taker sued LSAC contending that he was at an unfair disadvantage because he couldn't benefit from diagramming on the LSAT the same way that other test takers could. And so LSAC ultimately settled the lawsuit and said they would create a new version of the test without the current game section. They tried out some experimentation, but ultimately said, you know what, we're just going to get rid of the games and add in a second logical reasoning section. So of course, students have a choice to make. Do they want to take the LSAT before games is removed or after games is removed?
And how do you counsel students on making that decision? Because I know for me, which seems like a really long time ago at this point, over a decade ago, but when I took the LSAT, I actually really didn't mind the logic games. I think they were my best section. But I know a lot of students might not know that, especially before they start studying. So what are some pieces of advice that you give students when they're trying to figure out how they should study? It's February.
Of course. Yeah. So logic games, as you said, it can end up being your best section. For me, initially, it was my worst. It ended up being my best. And for a lot of students who end up getting top scores on the LSAT, they're getting perfect on games, maybe -1. They're losing their points on the other sections like logical reasoning and reading comp, where you have more of those perceived ambiguities of language. And so speaking now in February, if someone is brand new to the LSAT, I'd caution them to wait until after the change just because they're not going to have enough time to prep and take it with the game section. You've only got 2 more takes available. You have April and June. So that may not be enough time for someone who's brand new to the LSAT, but for someone who's been studying for a while, it may be possible for them to take it before the change. And I'd recommend that if they're going to be ready in time.
Now, if someone's been studying for the LSAT for a while, but logic games is actually still their worst section, do you recommend that they wait until August to take it? And what if they're feeling concerned because they really wanted to apply to law school early in September?
That's a great question. Yeah. So for someone who's been at this for a while and they've put in the work on logic games and it's a section they just can't crack and they know they would do better without the games and logical reasoning a strong suit for them, then I'd say, yeah, go ahead, take the LSAT in August because you could take it in August, get your score back at the end of August and still apply at the beginning of the cycle either way. So there's really no downside.
That's fair. That's fair. And how do you help students with the logical reasoning section? Because we talked about how logic games is the most learnable section. people don't often feel that way about logical reasoning, and certainly people don't feel that way about reading comprehension. I didn't mind reading comprehension, but I understand it gets a bad rap from people. So how do people feel, I guess, assured if they only have these two sections, which are not the most learnable sections?
Well, they can be learned. It may not be as easy to learn as games where you're not going to see the same degree of improvement because most people are just terrible at logic games when they start on it because they've never seen anything like it before. So that's why they get such a big increase. But logical reasoning is still learnable. Reading comprehension is still learnable as well. And consider that if you're taking the LSAT with only the two sections, two types of sections, reasoning and reading comp, there's less material you actually need to learn. So you can focus more of your attention on logical reasoning, and any gains you make there will be doubled because it's going to be two scored sections of the test out of the three scored sections. It's 2/3 of the test. And there are 15 roughly different types of logical reasoning questions. And so we just tackle them one by one, focusing on the most common types, the ones that show up most often, going down to the less common types. And there are plenty of review strategies we can implement to help you figure out what your weak areas are so that you can improve in those areas.
So this is something that I have always been interested in. So your LSAT score is good for 5 years. And I feel like for the last 5 years, the test has changed every year, personally. So we have people from 5 years ago who, probably still taking the test pen and paper. And then we have people who were doing the digital LSAT. We did the 4 section LSAT or the 3 section LSAT and the 4 section LSAT, right? And now we're going to have some people who have logic games on their score, some people who won't have logic games on their score. How does that all play out when all of these people apply to law school? Do the law schools even care what kind of test you took? Do they take that into consideration at all? Like, is that fair at all?
My understanding is that law schools don't care. They can't look into all of the details. Oh, this person took it in January 2020 before the pandemic when it was one format. This person took it in April 2022. It's gone through so many changes, as you said, and ultimately, law schools have no choice but to place a lot of trust in LSAC's contention about the validity of the exam, saying that taking it on paper versus a tablet versus online with ProctorU versus online with Prometric, 4 sections, 3 sections, 5 sections, they ultimately have to trust in LSAC's ability to analyze the data and say a 170 on this version of the test is the same as 170 on that version of the test. And also, if you consider law school's incentives, the score is getting reported to the American Bar Association, which is in turn going to US News, no matter what the format was. It's all still getting reported just the same. And law schools, and you know how much time they're spending looking at all these applicants, they can't get into all the details about which test format is better or worse or stronger or weaker. They've got to just say the score is the score and that's that.
Do we think that's fair? I mean, do you think that this new version of the test is just as hard as the version with logic games or the version with 5 sections?
That's a really good question. And so, yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, for an individual test taker, there's going to be somebody out there who's better at games than at reasoning, right? So if they get to take it before the change, they're going to do better than if they take it after the change. So for that individual, no, it's not fair. No, it's not the same. LSAC says in aggregate, when you take the average of everybody, it ends up ultimately washing out, which I'm like, maybe. But then if it's really the same, then why did the LSAT ever have a game section in the first place? Why couldn't they just save themselves some work and do reasoning only? And why did they say no to the blind test taker in the first place, leading to the lawsuit that led to this change? We also had a lot of LSAT score inflation at the beginning of the pandemic due to the fact that it was less stressful taking it at home, due to the fact that having 3 sections rather than 4 over that period was a little bit easier as well. And so if there was all that score inflation, the LSAT Flex was probably easier than the LSAT that preceded it. And now, maybe now the LSAT currently with 4 sections, not 3, where you don't have the same endurance factor, maybe the current version is a little bit tougher. And so I would take what they say with a grain of salt, but also they're the primary game in town. The other alternative exams have not made that many inroads, although maybe 10, 15 years that will change. And so I think for now, we've just got to go forward on the assumption with a certain degree of suspension of disbelief that all versions are the same.
Yeah, I do often wonder about equity with this, and I think that's fair to say. we don't really have a choice. This is sort of where we're at, and law schools do have to just accept a 170 as a 170 as a 170. It's interesting when I look at other test companies like the SAT, for example. Every time the SAT significantly changes, I feel like their scoring significantly changes, right? We went from 1600, like that's my parents' generation, it was at 1600. Then when I took it, it was at 2400. And now, it's back to 1600, but in a different way. But I feel like it's a very clear signaling this is a different test. And, I can't speak for the ACT as much, but for me at least, I felt like that added some integrity to the fact that no, the test that I took is not the same that my parents took is not the same that the kids right now are taking, and then that's fine, right? The test is still valid all the way across, but they're not the same test, and we can admit that and we can say that. So for me, it's been really interesting to see the changes in the LSAT with no changes in scoring, and no parity across different scorings.
You're right.
But
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. And the other thing to consider as well is that the people you're competing against, that's also a different cohort as well. I mean, if you talk to anyone who took the LSAT 20 plus, 30 plus years ago, your previous generations, they would tell you, I barely studied for this, yet I still did amazing. That is not the case today for the vast majority of people. The competition's a lot more severe. The quality of prep materials has increased a lot. I mean, if you go back to the 80s and early 90s, hardly anybody was using real, actual, official LSAT prep tests. None of the prep companies wanted to pay the licensing fees to LSAT to use the real exams. And so they were using all these fake questions that were of questionable validity, lots of mistakes. And then you'll see this if you get like an old book of like LSAT for Dummies or something. Don't use those, by the way. But the fact that the people study a lot more means perhaps that getting a 170 plus today is actually a much greater accomplishment than getting a 170 plus in the early 90s. And you see this as well from the raw score conversion charts as well. If you look at how LSAT converts a score out of 100 questions into a score out of 180, you can't get nearly as many questions wrong now as you could back then.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's very true, and really does also speak to the rise of the test prep industry, and of course, and I know that's your industry, but it does pose an equity question too about students that don't have as much access to prep, and what does it mean that it's so much more competitive, and what are we really testing? We have a lot of metaphysical
Of course, no,
existential
those are
questions about LSAT and test prep in general.
for sure, those are perfectly valid. I mean, I know that LSAC does a lot with Law Hub, and they do a lot of free events, and they have the fee waiver program, all of which are great. And they had the partnership with Khan Academy as well.
Yeah.
I would always love to see them do more, and I'm always encouraging them to do more. I mean, I'd love to see them giving away all the exams for free. For example, you're only getting 4 of them on Law Hub if you don't pay. If you get the fee waiver, then you get access for a certain defined period. But then, of course, there are people who don't qualify for the fee waiver who still have hardship for whatever reason. And so a lot of folks get left out of that. And so I'd love to see them just say, you know what, we don't need your $119 per year or whatever it is. We're sitting on plenty of money in the bank. Let's just give everybody the exams for free so that you don't need to shell out for that if it's a hardship. And then that will at least do something to level the playing field a bit more.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And while we're talking about test prep, I do want to know. So if we are focused on logical reasoning and reading comprehension, what are your tips, your tricks? Like, what are some things that you really encourage students to do if they're just starting out? Or actually, we have a lot of students who they're not just starting out, but they've really hit some sort of wall and they're kind of stuck, especially students that are stuck sub 150. Like, what are some pieces of advice that you have for those students?
Of course. So a lot of folks rush into taking timed sections and full length practice tests without getting the fundamentals down to determine when we're evaluating an argument in logical reasoning. For example, can I ID the conclusion? Can I ID the evidence? Can I evaluate the argument to see how reasonable it is? So start there just with the basics, the fundamentals, and make sure that you're good on the most common question types. Like I said earlier, there's roughly 15 different types of logical reasoning questions, but some are more common than others. So lock down the easy points, the lowest hanging fruit, the questions that show up most frequently, those being flaw questions, inference questions, and necessary assumptions. So start with those. Don't focus on the types that hardly ever show up. We'll get there. But for now, focus on the basics and the lowest hanging fruit. And make sure that you are not just blindly copying explanations or watching videos to get an understanding. Also, develop some self-reliance. Don't use them as a crutch and start evaluating your reasoning for yourself. to make sure that you're figuring out which tricks and traps you personally are uniquely prone to falling for so that you can better design a more personalized study plan going forward.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about students that say you can't really study for reading comprehension? What do you say to that?
Yes, I understand why people say that, but the thing is that although you've been reading your entire life, what you're reading on the LSAT is fundamentally different than what you're reading on a blog or on social media or a listicle or what you read in college. I mean, the LSAT passages are adapted from real world sources, but rewritten to be more boring and to be more legalese like. So what you want to do is adapt your reading style for the fact that the LSAT is written in a very particular way and that you have a very strict time constraint. So a lot of students studying for the LSAT, pre-law is going to law school, they want to understand everything and go through it with a fine-tooth comb to make sure they're not missing anything. And that is a great impulse. I'm not saying don't do that in life, but when it comes to the LSAT, it's so strictly timed that you have to engage in a sort of triage where you focus on the biggest priorities for now and then focus on the details later. So the biggest priorities would be figuring out what is the main idea of the passage? What is the author's opinion? What is the tone of the passage? What would be the best title of the passage? Because think about it. If you don't know the main idea, did you really get anything? So students will be able to list the details, but not know what the main point was. And the whole idea is to know the main point. It's like if you're watching a movie, you don't have to memorize every subplot, but you should know if this was comedy or romance or action, right? So you get the big picture. That's what you want to walk away with to start.
That makes a lot of sense. Before we end, I did want to ask your questions and talk a little bit about some of these other tests that you mentioned earlier. So I know, of course, there's the GRE. Students can take the GRE for most schools. And there's the JD-Next. I'd love to hear your opinions on both of these options.
Of course. So I'll start with the GRE. That's been around for a little while now. And I understand that dozens of schools are officially, formally accepting applicants with only GRE scores. But my understanding is, and you can tell me what you've heard, that is that very few applicants are actually getting in with just a GRE score. So it isn't actually having that much of an impact percentage-wise in the applicant pool. But what are you hearing about that?
So I think what's really interesting is that I feel like schools are in three camps, right? So the ABA has officially said that all schools can accept the GRE. So, there's that. And I think like maybe two camps. One is schools that will accept your GRE, but if you've taken the LSAT, they're going to take the LSAT score, right? And so you deciding to sit for the LSAT and then later deciding to take the GRE, what they're going to report is your LSAT score. That's what they're going to go off of. I think there's a much more narrow subset of schools that will allow you to just submit your GRE even if you've taken the LSAT. Like, I think that's a very small, narrow subset of schools. And I think most applicants end up taking the LSAT first because that's just what they hear, that's just what they know. They might have realized, oh, I could take the GRE like later. And then because they've already taken the LSAT, the number of schools that are going to disregard their LSAT scores is very small. And so we don't end up seeing a lot of applicants with just a GRE score reported. I think the applicants that we see with just a GRE, I know Harvard does not care if you take the LSAT or the GRE, truly does not care. It does not matter to them. And so we see a lot of applicants that are dual degree applicants. And I think those are really the applicants who are like, well, I'm going to take the GRE for this other degree, so let me just take the GRE. That is, by and large, I think a very small percentage of applicants that have the foresight and the planning, and also are applying to schools that really don't have a preference, who then end up only taking the GRE. And so you're right. When you look at the 509 data, we don't really have data on medians and those sort of things for GRE applicants.
Right, exactly. Yes, that's the thing. As you said, that if you have an LSAT score on record, that is going to be considered. And so it may be too late to even bother with the GRE at that point if the LSAT was tough and you took it officially and that's on record. In contrast, as you said, for Harvard, for example, the quality of the applicants getting in are probably super strong anyway. And they're just they're narrowing their focus to say, why study for two different exams if I'm taking the GRE anyway for a master's or a PhD or whatever, or the business school, then they'll just say, you know what, let me get the strongest GRE score possible, never touch the LSAT, and my 800 on the GRE or whatever it's currently out of will be sufficient to get me in anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's correct. But unfortunately, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, right? We don't have enough applicants, so that we never have enough data, and then because we don't have the data, applicants are like, I don't know what to do if my GRE score is enough, so I'm just going to take the LSAT so that we continue to not have enough data. And I feel like
Hmm.
we've been stuck in that cycle for a couple of years where, yeah, the issue is we don't have data, so I can't advise you like, oh yes, that GRE score is fine for that school. Like I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the LSAT has so much longevity behind it that I think it's going to be tough for any other exam to crack that. And LSAC also does a lot to serve the law schools, and they have they've provided lots of value for law schools in different ways. And so I think that also plays a certain semi-monopolistic role still, even if the GRE exists and the JD-Next exists. LSAC is, of course, doing everything it can to remain relevant. And so I think that they're work with the law schools and their marketing to pre-laws and providing the services for the applications as well, it's going to lead them to maintain a significant hold for quite some time.
Now, are your thoughts about the JD Next the same as your thoughts about the GRE?
The JD, well, yes and no. I mean, I think that the JD-Next still will not make significant inroads in the short term. I did notice that maybe a month or so ago, the ABA really tore it apart. I mean, the ABA did their own external analysis of the data that JD-Next had provided regarding its validity, and they just destroyed it. I mean, there are a number of questionable claims that the people behind JD-Next are making in terms of its predictive validity and the fact that it seems to show no significant disparity between racial and ethnic groups, which is, of course, a pretty surprising result. So I am curious to see more data and curious to see what JD-Next has to say in response to those critiques.
Yeah, I'm interested in it. And I would say we've had more students ask us about the JD Next than we've had students ask us about the GRE. I think people like the idea that you can study for it over time and it's more content based. It seems, I think, more tangible of a concept to people, but I again don't have data, so it's been a very interesting thought process rather than an actual like practical advice that I'm giving students right now.
It is intriguing. It is intriguing. I mean, also, there's the fact that you need to be qualified to take that prep course, the law school course leading up to the exam. And so that's only available in select locations. I mean, I remember that there was one law school, maybe it was Arizona, that claimed that the best admissions test is an actual semester of law school. And so that was a pretty creative way to navigate the language around valid and reliable test for admissions. And so they had students who were just doing a semester of law school. And if they did well, they continued. If not, they didn't. A rather expensive test considering the tuition
Yeah.
for a semester of law school. But I do like the idea of giving people a sort of
A
more
chance.
miniature, a chance, a more miniature version, maybe not with the hefty price tag. I'd love to see law schools have a bit more skin in the game around that, where they could
Yeah.
say, for example, we're going to admit you provisionally. And if you continue beyond semester number one, then we're going to charge you for semester number one. But if you flunked semester number one or didn't perform at a certain benchmark, we're just not going to charge you. And so that would then give schools more incentive to admit students who they believed were likely to do well. And then the students could prove themselves. And so this is not the JD Next. This is just my own idea. If I were to have a law school, this is what I'd like to do. But I do think it's interesting to give people the chance to actually see what law school is like and be evaluated on that. The LSAT, of course, does have predictive validity, but we can all agree it's not directly tied to the practice of law in the same way or what you do in law school in the same way.
Yeah, and I mean, I know this would only really help students that are still in college, and most of our students that we work with are actually non-traditional students. But I could even see there being you're taking one of your second semester senior year classes is a law school course, right? It's something along those lines, maybe in partnership with your undergrad in the law school or something like that. And so I know that they have these 3+3 programs and sort of things like that. But I do think because there's so many countless stories of people who can't do well on the LSAT but did fine in law school, right? And there are stories of people who did great on the LSAT and did not do well in law school. It goes both ways. And people who did well in the LSAT and became terrible lawyers. So there are really like a lot of different ways that this can pan out. But I do like, having the proof in the pudding, right? Like show me that you can do well. Okay, great. I've always felt, and I think this is mostly because I went to Harvard and we don't have timed exams. We do sort of, but most of my 1L exams, at least when I went, I don't know what's going on now, but at least when I went, most of my 1L exams were take home open book 8-hour exams. Right. And so I've always questioned the correlation between the timed nature of the LSAT and then my 8-hour open book exams that I took as my 1L year, right? Like if LSAT is supposed to predict your 1L year, I think for many schools, probably. But for a school that has 8-hour exams for most of its 1L curriculum, I don't know that that's like the greatest correlation. And so I've always been interested in is if we change also the law school format, does that change then the predictive nature of these tests?
Oh yes, totally. I mean, there is so much about the LSAT that is arbitrary. I mean, why 35 minutes specifically per section, right? And why swap games for reasoning and say it's still the same exam? So there are a lot of elements here that seem just random. And to make a radical change would maybe change nothing in terms of the predictive value, or maybe make it more predictive. So yeah, it is interesting. I think I'm curious to see what the data shows, but yeah, think there's a lot of room for improvement, both on the standardized testing front as well as in the nature of legal education itself, as we've seen lots of criticism in recent years. How related is it to what lawyers actually do?
Mm.
Not very much. Your people graduate law school, then you need to be taught how to be a lawyer
Yeah,
as a
that was
first
me.
year associate. So it's like, well, what did this person pay $200,000 for, if not just to take the bar exam and then not know how to practice law? So
Yeah.
I think revisions to the nature of legal education would then necessitate a trickle down to the format around the exams itself also having a change.
Absolutely. Steve, this has been wonderful. I feel like I could talk to you about testing and legal education all day. Is there anything else that you feel like we didn't cover, either about the test, the changes, preparing for the test, your work, anything at all that we didn't cover?
Well, thank you. I want to just end by echoing one thing you said, which is that, of course, the LSAT is not your destiny, right? So it does not dictate how you're going to do in law school or how you're going to be as an attorney. It's just one factor among many. So if you're having difficulty cracking the LSAT, don't take no for an answer. Definitely give it another shot and another shot after that. Law schools don't average multiple LSAT scores. They only take the highest. So even if you've taken it before and you didn't do as well as you would have liked, of course, it's not too late. You can retake it 2, 3, 4, 5 times or more. And law schools will only take the highest score. So don't take no for an answer. Keep pushing. And of course, I have a variety of ways that can help. Folks can always feel free to reach out. Again, LSAT Unplugged across all social media. Email me, help@lsatunplugged.com. I'm happy to help.
Awesome. Well, we are so glad that we had Steve Schwartz from LSAT Unplugged here. If you liked this episode, make sure that you share it with a friend because sharing is caring. Make sure that you like and comment, rate and review, subscribe to our channel. And if you have a question that you want us to answer live, make sure that you submit questions to bit.ly/break into law school. We are so excited to be able to help you on this journey. You can see all the different ways that we can help you with small group boot camps, one-on-one consulting, and also if you have an LSAC fee waiver, our Master Your Personal and Diversity Statement course is completely for free. As our gift to you, we are a nonprofit, so all of our services are on a sliding scale, and we look forward to seeing you back next week. Thanks so much, Steve.